How did it happen? Investigators are still trying to figure out why a Delta Airlines flight crashed, flipped upside down, and caught fire after landing Monday at Toronto's Pearson International Airport.
Everything, drop it. Come on. Don't take it away.
Remarkably, all 80 people on board made it out alive. There were at least 18 people injured. Listen to this exchange between air traffic control and a medevac pilot just moments after impact.
Where's the crash? It's on runway 23, right at threshold, right at this intersection there, 23 and 15 left. On Life Flight 1 medevac, just so you are, there's people outside walking around the aircraft there.
Yeah, we've got it. The aircraft there's upside down and burning.
When the plane came to rest, buckled passengers found themselves hanging upside down. At least one wing of the aircraft torn off, the plane on fire.
It was mass chaos. I was upside down. The lady next to me was upside down. We kind of let ourselves go and fell to hit the ceiling, which is surreal feeling. And then everybody was just like, get out, get out, get out.
We didn't really know anything was the matter, or at least I didn't, until like the second we hit the ground. There was no like real indication of anything. And then, yeah, we hit the ground and we were sideways and then we were upside down, hanging like bats.
Absolutely incredible. Let's bring in CNN transportation analyst Mary Schiavo. Mary, based on the footage and what we know so far, have you been able to draw any initial conclusions about what could have happened here?
Well, yes, the footage and then also the air traffic control communications and the weather alerts, METARs, meteorological warnings that are specific to the airport. And so the plane was coming in. They did have warnings that the winds were 23 to 37 knots, which is pretty tough on a Canadair regional jet 900. Then they had crosswind warnings of maybe 30 to 40 knots, which depending upon the conditions at the airport can exceed actually the recommended performance for the Canadair regional jet. They were coming down, there was some variation according to publicly available radar and the ground speed and the sink rate. So that means they were getting gusts of wind as they were coming down, and they smacked down pretty hard according to the eyewitness or the ear witness reports and those people on the plane right at the end of the threshold of the runway. And at that point, what looks like might have happened from very grainy videotape from other cameras is the landing gear, the rear gear, might have snapped off at that point, along with the right wing, which with the left wing still on the plane, lifts the plane, causing a plane to roll and cartwheel. That's my best guess. It's only a guess at this point, and the investigators will have it real soon because they have the pilots to talk to, and of course the flight data recorders.
Yeah, a true miracle that there are so many people that they can interview about what happened because everyone survived this crash landing. CNN safety analyst David Susi drew some similar observations about what may have caused the crash, including some of those questions about the landing gear. I'd like to play that and get your response.
There are a lot of clues that you can see right away. The things I'd be looking at right away are, was it a hard landing? We look at the fact that the landing gear aren't on the aircraft. So are they there, or did they get torn off in the accident, or perhaps they weren't even down at the time? So there's a lot of questions, but I think a quick visual of the aircraft on site would give them a lot of clues as to where this goes.
Mary, you mentioned the fact that you believe that the landing gear snapped off upon impact, but how could investigators prevent something like this from happening in the future? Is it a matter of de-icing the plane, clearing the runway, or simply not flying or landing in conditions as dangerous as the ones you were describing?
Well, you know, every plane has its own limits, and this one has more crosswind limits than, for example, a larger plane. But, you know, Toronto Pearson, that's a great airport, operates around the year, around the clock, and they do have all the services to clear the runway. But you can see even the videotape, there was tremendous blowing winds, blowing snow, etc. And that reduces the crosswind limits of the Canadair regional jet and all jets tremendously. So, for example, you might have a 37 crosswind allowance for that aircraft, but if the runway is not clear, if it's icy, if there's reduced braking, et cetera, that could fall to as low as a 15-knot crosswind. So what you have to do is every pilot and every airline has to make their decisions based on the operational limits of that aircraft.
Mary, there are going to be questions, perhaps reasonably, about just the frequency of some of these crashes that we've seen with obviously different outcomes. But in just the last 30 days, you had the midair collision above the Potomac River in Washington, D.C. with 67 victims. You had the medevac flight that crashed outside Philadelphia with 7 victims, a Bering Air flight in Alaska that had 10 victims, and of course, miraculously, just 18 injured in that crash landing in Toronto that we were just discussing. Do you see this as a coincidence? Do you see this in perhaps a lapse in safety, in personnel? Are there any dots that we can connect here?
Well, with the last two, weather certainly played an important role, both in Alaska and in this crash. And it's, the tough winter conditions, accidents can increase. And it depends on the operational limits of your aircraft and sometimes just freak winds and other issues. But for the other two, there's no commonality. And what we always looked for, when I was with the Department of Transportation, you look for patterns, you look for trends, you look for data that you can connect. Now, of course, in the Washington, D.C. flight, they had some very consistent data, and that is they had, I think, probably 100 or so alerts that the helicopter traffic was causing conflict, loss of airspace separation with commercial air traffic. So that's a very important trend that somebody should have recognized long before this fatal crash in Washington, D.C. With the others, there's no commonality. So you're always looking for if there's a trend out there that the safety investigators and the safety regulators haven't picked up. And so obviously they're going to be wanting to look at weather performance. But in D.C., I think they're going to want to separate the military helicopters forever from the passenger service aircraft at DCA.
That's such important context. We are so appreciative for your expertise, Mary Schiavo. Thank you so much for joining us. Retired American Airlines pilot Les Abend joins us. Les, pilots train for moments like these, hoping that you never encounter them. But based on what you've seen, have you drawn any conclusions about what caused this accident?
Well, I have, Kayla, to some extent. Maybe I'll give you a little better perspective on what pilots would have been thinking just prior to this landing. I would have known that this wind was gusty. We would have added a factor we call gust factor to it. Hopefully that's what they did. It's an easy mathematical formula that just adds a little bit of extra airspeed to the speed that we're at over the threshold. And that would have been important. And the reason I bring that up is because if they didn't add that speed in a gusty wind condition, it's possible what we're hearing being reported by passengers that were on that flight, that they may have just fallen very quickly from a short altitude like 10 feet, which makes all the difference in the world. That aircraft may have sheared off one of the landing gear in a bad situation. So the other thing that I would have been thinking of before I started this landing was what we call the runway condition assessment matrix. What were various sections of the runway like? With blowing snow, even though it would give you a report of each section of the runway based on a number, like from 1 to 6, with blowing snow, it may have changed rapidly. So the airplane that landed ahead of this aircraft may have had a different condition than this particular Delta regional jet that landed. When it landed, it may have hit slippery conditions right off the bat, and if it didn't take what we call the crab out, where the airplane is cocked going down the runway, it may have caused the gear to come off, and then it hit a dry spot, and then it was almost like breaking the aircraft, and then it rolled over like we see in these pictures.
Let's talk a little bit about how a plane like this is constructed, because we've now heard some of these passengers describe them being suspended, hanging like bats, with the seats remaining intact on the floor. How are these planes built to withstand something like this, and how remarkable is it that it held up?
Well, it is remarkable, and the fact that these seats stayed where they are is part of the expert design of this particular aircraft, as with other manufacturers as well. It's designed to stay in position in an emergency evacuation or a crash situation, so passengers don't go screaming forward in a sudden stop situation. What's amazing to me, one of the things that wasn't pointed out perhaps, was these flight attendants had the presence of mind not only to get the passengers out, because you can see it in that video, but they may have, more than likely, they disabled the slides, because when those emergency doors are open, those slides automatically deploy, and that would have impeded the exit of these passengers with an airplane upside down. So that's a very important factor, I think, that these investigators may be looking into.
We're going to be learning a lot more about this situation, what happened, and how those 80 people were able to survive. But we appreciate your expertise this morning, Les Abend. Thank you for joining us.